For this next installment of the 2021 FishHawk Turkey Trot t-shirt design, the rough design stage is now finished, and it's time for a first take on the vector illustrations. Now, for those of you who may be watching and either might not be artists necessarily and just enjoy art, or for those of you who might be aspiring artists or young artists who work in the traditional medium and haven't really worked in digital media yet, something to keep in mind if you ever progress in digital media or decide to get into digital media is the difference between vectors and rasters. So this particular project is being done in vectors. The software that's being used for this is called Adobe Illustrator, and Adobe Illustrator is specifically for vector-based art. So what are vectors? Vectors are when you're creating the shapes in a sense using mathematics, but we don't have to know that math going into it. The math is being done by the software itself. And the advantage of it is that you're able to rescale and make some minor adjustments to the points of your illustration, and as small as a thumbnail or as large as a billboard, without losing visual quality of that particular art. If you've ever gone online and have ever seen a picture or a photo or a graphic that's very blurry, grainy, there's a term for it called pixelation, and that's usually an issue of the pixel image or the raster-based image, which is made of small dots, where they've been scaled up or they're at a too low of a resolution, and it causes the picture to have these like kind of garish edges to them. You're never really going to see that in vectors unless they've been maybe exported as a raster, type of image, like a JPEG or a PNG, and then have been resized or blown up to a size that's too small, or that's too large. But if you have the original vector file and you enlarge it from there, you should never have a problem, that kind of problem. Other issues might come up depending on the construction of the vectors, but in particular, that's not really anything we have to worry too much about with vector-based projects. Now, the way you create vectors, that can be a challenge that I find my students will sometimes struggle with when they're working with vectors for the first time, because it's a little less intuitive than in pixels or raster-based software, where it's a little bit more what you see is what you get. You can take the paintbrush tool and start painting, and it can kind of feel a little bit closer to traditional media. Also, the final output of pixel-based projects tend to have an output that look a little bit more similar to traditional medium, especially depending on the software that you're using. The concept of how vectors work is you use paths and fills. So with paths, you have to lay down your anchor points, and then use handles to kind of control the curves. And that can feel very, I think, challenging to deal with, or very unintuitive, very technical, where it kind of like hurts the creativity. I think can be a challenge of vector-based software for people who aren't used to using it for that purpose. I definitely struggled with it when I was first learning vectors, and it took a few years before I got more comfortable with it, and now it's second nature to me, but it took a while to do it well. Now, something that I strongly recommend if you're ever working with a software like Illustrator is I wouldn't recommend just going straight up into it and using it as like your base, I guess is your base drawing. I would recommend having a sketch. You really wouldn't want to use Illustrator to do the sketch with. There are some software that draw in vectors in an intuitive way, like Harmony. But usually if I'm doing an illustration rather than an animation, I won't typically use Harmony for that. I would use something like Photoshop, or in this example here with FishHawk Turkey Trot, I was using Clip Studio Paint to do the undersketch. And then you just import the undersketch into Illustrator, use it as a base, and then you can trace on top of it. One thing that's nice about it is when you place your points down, you can move them around. Unlike when you're, let's say, drawing with a pen tool or a drawing pen on paper, you may have a line that's almost right, but then there might be something a little off about it. Like, oh, I wish I could just tweak this a little bit, just move this line over just a bit. Well, with vectors, you can. Now, with vectors, there are a couple ways that you can lay down your lines. The one that I'm using for this example here is predominantly the pen tool, which the pen tool can feel a little bit hard to work with at first if you're not used to it, but it's pretty nice. It's nice for drawing more perfect curves. It's not quite as good if you want to do very naturalistic, so in this case, the fluff of the turkey's feathers. I would switch out of the pen tool for that and move on to what's called the pencil tool, which is kind of funny because you think the pencil tool would be for like rough sketching and the pen would be for drawing on top, at least if you were comparing it to traditional media. But that's not quite the case here. The pencil tool is more of a free-handed pen tool in a sense. But you got to be a little careful about that. Usually with my students, they'll prefer using the pencil tool or the blob brush tool, which I generally don't recommend using the blob brush tool. It's not a bad tool, it's just you lose a lot of control with it. But the pencil tool, to kind of freehand all your paths, which is cool, but the problem with using the pencil tool too much is that you can get wobbly or uncontrolled lines, and it can be a lot harder to try and fix those lines, because usually when you're drawing straight up, freehand, it will place points down where it thinks it should be, and it's usually a little too much. So you have a lot of extra points to work with, and you can end up getting wobbly lines, so it kind of looks like you had too much coffee when drawing. So that was something I had to be a little careful of here with the turkey, but I just used it to draw like the fuzzy edges and the top of their heads, and sometimes I have to draw it a few times over, but it wasn't too excessive. But anything other than that, I mostly try to stick with the pen tool. There's also another tool or another palette that's really nice for Illustrator that I love to use. It's called Pathfinder palette. You can see it up there on the upper right. Honestly, between the pen tool, the pencil tool, and the Pathfinder, that probably covers a good 75% to 80% of everything that I do in Illustrator. And then I use other tools, as needed for particular instances. But what the Pathfinder allows you to do is allows you to create complex shapes by combining shapes together or punching holes in shapes or breaking them apart. I use them a lot for breaking apart. So here with the socks, for example, I wanted to be able to have stripes on these socks, but I need to make sure that they conform to the edge of the socks so you don't have like weird outlines around them. You want it to look like one continuous line on the edges of each of the socks. So what I do for that is I draw the complete shape of the outline of the socks, and then I draw the stripes, but you want to make sure that they're too long and they overlap the edges of the outline of the leg. And then I can use the Pathfinder. The one that I use in particular for this is called Divide, and that allows me to cut into those shapes. So when you need separate colors, you can place that down there. I hope this is not too confusing. This is a little bit less of a tutorial on Illustrator specifically, and more of just like, oh, here's Illustrator, here's some cool things that I can do. If there is some interest in Illustrator and like how to use Illustrator or anything in particular about Illustrator, let me know, and I'll be interested, and I'd be happy to consider doing a tutorial on it. For Fate Saga, I do use Illustrator, not for the animation, but for the pin designs for Kane and Larkspur's pins. I had used Illustrator for that. Some of the things that you would use Illustrator for professionally are like logo designs. So Fate Saga's logo is done in Illustrator. The pin design, so anything that you would want to have printed, generally, if you can do it in Illustrator, it's beneficial to do it in Illustrator. Now, and also in projects that have a limited color palette, so the pins have a limited color palette. This project in particular has a limited color palette, although the colors that you're going to see used here are like a first draft. So I'm paying attention to it, but I'm not being strict with the color use just yet. But with the two Fate Saga pins, there was a limited of colors, because what happens is with like pin designs or t-shirt designs, and other types of media, you might have once you reach a certain number of colors, it can start to get more expensive for every additional color applied. And so it becomes a matter of, okay, how important is it for that extra color to be there? Sometimes you may have colors that are close enough that are like, well, if I have these two blues that are almost the same and I use the exact same blue for them both, would it matter? Like, would it be worth an extra, let's say, $20 or $10 or $5 for each additional print? Because that can make it more expensive to try to make some of these t-shirts or pins for the initial cost, or it can cause you to have to increase the price of the product that you're trying to make. And then if somebody is interested in your t-shirt or in your pins and your prices seem a little bit exorbitant to them, they're going to be less likely to buy it, or they're going to think that you're purposely trying to overcharge them, where the problem is you're just trying to make enough money to make back on the initial costs. And of course, we want to try to make the project the best that we can make it, but we also have to be realistic in terms of budget and what we have to work with and what we'd likely be able to sell or make the best use of the budget that we have. So sometimes it's not always a matter of making everything perfect. It's really just trying to make it look as good as we can with the constraints, the realistic constraints that we have. Okay, and that is working with Adobe Illustrator using vectors to create a real-world project. I hope you found this demonstration to be interesting. If you have any questions or comments or requests for any kind of future tutorials, feel free to leave a comment. I thank you so much for your time and for checking us out, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.